Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am joined by the architect and writer Sam Jacob. Sam is the founder and director of Sam Jacob Studio, an architecture and design practice based in London. He's written for all sorts of architecture publications and is currently professor of architecture at University of Illinois at Chicago and is a visiting professor at the Yale School of Architecture. I first started following Sam's work because of his writing, and for a long time saw him first as a writer before I saw any of his architecture or design work. But writing actually came later in his career, and in this episode we talk about how and why he started writing and how it's grown to become such a big part of his work. We also talk about the intersection of writing and design and how those kind of relate to each other in his own practice. We talk about the design writing class that he teaches in Chicago and the political dimension to all of his work. This was a really fun one for me. Sam is someone who I've been reading for years and have wanted to get on the podcast for a while, and just found this conversation really, really great. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or just $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I think of as the director's commentary for the podcast. Each month I share additional content, give some episode previews, and write short essays related to the themes of the podcast. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Sam Jacob. I was thinking about you, I was thinking about this conversation and kind of what I wanted to talk to you about, and I realized that for a long time I knew you as a writer before I knew you as an architect. I had been reading your work before I had ever kind of like seen any of your work, and so to me, I always think of you as a writer first, and I'm kind of curious what came first for you. Was it architecture or was it writing?
I'd be curious, what did you think when you saw the work? Was it what you expected?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good...
What is this guy doing?
That's a good question. You know, I would say it is what I expected, and we can get into that in a
right.
bit, because there's some things that I like about your writing that I definitely see in your work also. Yeah. But yes, it wasn't like I was like, oh, I don't like this guy anymore.
I guess I came to writing quite late. Like, it was a thing which it definitely came after design.
Okay.
Right? Like I didn't really write when I was studying. I didn't write when I was first kind of designing stuff. And it kind of came later. And it came, I suppose, because of a few things. Really, like the sort of the world of work that I was involved in was quite wide ranging. Like it was never, you could say, like a traditional architecture practice.
Right.
It was always interested in like connections across and between things, and like trying to understand the world as much as make the world.
Yeah.
And at the time, that sort of practice felt like it was definitely on the margins of kind of discussions around the subject, or the way in which the discipline addressed the world or understood the world. And so it began with a very small, very kind of almost like ridiculous idea, which was like, what if you started to think of things in the world and sort of considered them from a sort of design perspective? And that meant like reviews, basically.
Right.
And it started with very, very short reviews. And it was reviews of like I think it was like a pair of headphones,
okay.
Like a box of matches, like a free newspaper, with, well, I don't know if it was still free, if it was free at that point, but it was like the Friday London evening newspaper, which comes with a a magazine insert, which is in a kind of plastic bag, which always kind of slips out of the newspaper as you've got it folded. And
Right.
it's like they weren't even reviews in the sense of like being a review. They were like, maybe 150 words, 200 words, really short.
Yeah.
And I started doing those because I felt.
And this was just for yourself? You were just writing these like
I think it was
for yourself, or like kind of posting these online, or how was that happening?
It was a nascent blog.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, like slightly before content management systems.
Okay, nice.
Kind of both blessed and cursed us.
Yeah.
So I think it was still hard coded HTML.
Nice.
With lots of pop-up windows, like very kind of 1997 web design.
Yeah. I love it.
You remember that? I don't know if you remember that.
Yep. Oh, I remember that. That was my first website too.
Yeah. And so it felt like there was also a gap that felt like there was kind of architecture and design media, and there was even more of it. There was a lot of it then, but it maybe at that moment served like other purposes, or was written by other kinds of people, like that. For example, Blueprint, which had been maybe like Maverick in the 80s when it had started, suddenly didn't really mean much to me. Like it,
right.
The stuff I wanted to write wasn't academic, so it was much more. In a way, like much more journalistic, but it felt like, basically it felt like there was nothing I wanted to read. So I thought, well, hold on a minute, I better write it.
right. Yeah, that's the way it always is. It seems like.
Yeah, and that was the sort of origin of it. But very shortly after that, I got a call from Marcus Fairs, who at the time was launching Icon.
Okay.
And he said, "Oh, Sam, have you guys got any projects you want to you feel like you want to publish in Icon?" And like, as usual, we're like, "No, we haven't got any projects." But I was like, "But I would love to write a review." And so the first review I wrote for Icon, which must have been issue 1 or issue 2, was on Resident Evil.
Okay.
Like on the N64, I think it was.
Nice.
And like, first of all, I thought, oh my God, like it's really important to write about video games as a form of architecture, but also to sort of place, not just to say that this is a valid form of like spatial design or whatever it is, but more to place it within a context of architectural culture. So I think the main kind of, it was sort of simultaneously a review of OMA's House in Bordeaux.
Oh,
which,
interesting.
You know that one? It's like on 3 levels with a kind of sort of room elevator that goes between those levels. The levels have these very different characteristics. I think the concept is something like cave, forest, sky.
Right. I remember this. Yeah.
And so it felt to me that what was happening in Resident Evil, which of course is set in a, kind of spooky mansion above ground, but connects into a mysterious and sinister laboratory below ground, was, in some ways a similar kind of...
Yeah, that's interesting.
Similar kind of thing. So that was, I guess, the first sort of published thing that I wrote. And then after that, I just, basically just carried on doing it.
This is maybe a weird question, but what was that? I'm very curious what that experience was like of, not really being a writer, not really even kind of considering yourself a writer, doing much writing before, and then suddenly you're writing this piece that's kind of connecting all of these different things, and I imagine you're working with an editor for the first time. What was that process like? Because you obviously kept doing it.
It took me probably 6 weeks to write, 900 words, because I was like, but I just really loved it. I really enjoyed it. And you have to remember, like, the process of like designing things, especially in architecture, is not one where you ever get to
Right.
do what you want.
Right.
Like it's like the processes are, even on the shortest projects, are kind of, they're like the timescales like geological in
Right.
comparison to writing, or writing most things.
Right.
Um, there's so many constraints. There's so many people that you have to deal with. So the ability or the opportunity to sort of, like shut the door after work, like, metaphorically pour yourself a whiskey and
Right. Yeah.
I stress metaphorically.
Yeah. Yeah. I was gonna say sometimes not metaphorically.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I don't know. Well, for me, definitely metaphorically.
Okay.
But it's just a very. I mean, the experience of doing it, the act of doing it, is so different that it's also like it's a kind of release and relief, like a kind of holiday from.
Yeah.
But and actually, I've always wanted to do both. I've always found that it's been a really productive relationship, that I've never, stopped doing one
Right. Right.
or the other once I'd
Yeah.
started spinning both plates.
Yeah. I read an interview with you in preparing for this, and you said something to the effect of how you always have seen your design practice, or even just kind of design practice in general. I'm not sure if you're even talking about your own work specifically, as this kind of combination between like making and research and criticism, that all of this was just part of the design process. And so it seems like writing is just a very natural output of that process also.
Yeah. I mean, for a long time, I felt that projects were a form of criticism, or in a sense were a form of journalism. Like, the projects should be about something,
right.
that they should have a kind of thesis to them,
yeah.
that they should, within, in architecture, where you have things like context and place and history and people and communities and, all of these kinds of things, that somehow the project narrates those experiences as well, or those, aspirations or concerns, and that somehow it may be kind of manifested as something physical, material and spatial, but actually, it is something which acts as a form of criticism, or as a story, or as a narrative, not in the same sense as a piece of writing, and not that it should be read in the same way, but that somehow there's some similarity between the two, or at least my approach was that design should have the same kind of attitude. It should have the same motivation, the same kind of energy, and the same desire to have, almost like a kind of beginning, middle, and end.
Right.
There should be a takeaway from it, which is more than kind of like general abstract experience. There should be like, kind of an idea which you could perhaps put into words. And that somehow the barrier between the two, like, if you think of the way that criticism usually works within architecture, is once the building's complete, that then the critic comes and performs at least that's the olden days.
Yeah, right.
Performs their duty as critic. And I felt that actually, what if you almost like reversed that, or mixed it up?
I mean, that, speaking of kind of going back to your first question to me about when I saw your work, how did it kind of relate to your writing? And to me, that's what I've always liked about your writing. And then when I did see your work, I thought your work was the same way, is that it wasn't just about making buildings, just like your writing isn't about like, talking about what a building looks like, what you were just talking about. It's not kind of just straight review of this building. You're always kind of zooming out a little bit to look at the larger world, to ask these kind of bigger questions, to think about these kind of larger narratives. And I think you do that in your writing, and I think you do that in your work also. Where did that this is a big question. Where'd that kind of come from? Or can you talk a little bit about how you started to see architecture that way, or start to kind of see your practices that way?
Hmm. I don't know about where it started, but like I'd say that the it's just a sensibility, I'd say, or a
Yeah.
kind of like a way in which I think that, kind of work or cultural production of any type
Hmm.
is both its own thing, like in a sense, like, kind of like autonomous, but also directly connected to the world and acts as a mirror lens, comment on new way of
Right.
seeing. So that, yeah, that's what I enjoy in the books that I read, the films that I watch, the the music that I listen to, is that,
Yeah.
yeah, in and of itself, of course, like as a thing produced within that particular medium or within that discipline, but also the ways in which it is responding to its circumstance, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. So I guess, let me think how to ask this question. I say this a lot to people that I talk to, and I always get a little bit self-conscious because it's a blanket statement about graphic design, and it's very much related to my own experience in that when I studied graphic design in undergrad, it was very much about aesthetics. It was very much about kind of Swiss modernism. Here's how you set up grids. Here's how you make good graphic design. And
Hmm.
there wasn't a lot of discussion about the larger context of which these things will then go into.
Hmm.
And I remember when I got out of school and I started to realize that, it completely changed kind of how I thought about design, or graphic design specifically.
Hmm.
And I'm curious what that's like in architecture. Is there something like that where it's just kind of, you could approach something as purely aesthetic, purely formal, versus something, and I don't mean to set these as complete opposites. I think there's a lot more flexibility between them, but versus a practice like yours, which is very much kind of responding to, critiquing, thinking about things, and then the form comes out of that, versus,
Hmm.
kind of formal ideas first. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and then there's so many different approaches. You could say that, within architecture, you have, certain approaches like place professionalism at
Yeah.
the top of the list, and that then try to resolve something which kind of looks vaguely okay
Right, 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 right.
amongst,
Yeah.
like in between the sort of the professional kind of procedure. There are others who are interested in particular, like formal approaches, or kind of languages, or sometimes styles.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then I think there's a space which is sort of in between the two, which is the space which I've always been interested in, which is, well, all of these things are kind of functions of each other.
Right.
Anyway, even the ways in which we are kind of the demands of our like professional behavior are not innocent and natural and normal. They're a function of a kind of advanced economies and late capitalism, and they have embedded within them very clear sort of interests, which
Right.
nevertheless remain undeclared. And so I just think, like, the design process is a process which is about thinking, is a process about how do you bring something into the world. And it from my perspective, that demands that you first of all try to understand the
Hmm.
world,
Right.
and then also kind of imagine the world which you want to create,
Yeah.
because every project is about creating a world, in a sense, like whatever
Yeah.
size that world might be, object, room,
Yeah.
interior, building,
Right.
place, city, planet,
Yeah.
whatever. And so I think it's, yeah, that somehow the kind of the way that I imagine the architect and the designer's role is a sort of fulcrum between those
Yeah.
two things, and that's where kind of really relevant and engaged projects emerge. But I also feel that that's something which is in part conceptual, but it's also about making things which are really like surprising and engaging and interesting, that people really want to be in and use, and those kinds of things. Yeah. It also means like understanding like how it means to work in, whatever part of the 21st century we happen to be in, because even the modes of working are kind of have changed dramatically from traditional ideas of what that should be, and that it actually begins to address a whole set of what are sometimes termed practical issues. Like it's absolutely to do with budget. It's absolutely to do with like deliverability, and understanding how those issues are part of the kind of concept, a part of the idea, a part of the world, and that they're things that you can actively work with. And I think that's that's why I feel like fundamentally is the designer's responsibility, is to be sort of a conduit where all of these different concerns flow. Like if you look at my desk, it's got like building contracts on it. It's got like a whole pile of like admin invoices, but it's also got weird plank tape product, a printout of a like 1972 Arcazoom concept thing, it is a reflection basically of my mind, and all of the things, and I feel that the sort of the alchemy of a project is when those things actually come together in a way which has like real synergy.
Yeah. I'm always struck by how you talk about your design process and how you talk about your architecture you use very literary words. You use the vocabulary of writing. It seems like you talk a lot about story and fiction and discourse and myth. And I'm curious if these ideas that you're thinking about in your work, are these the same ideas you're thinking about when you're writing, like whether you're writing an essay or working on a design project, are they coming from the same place?
Yeah, I would say they are. Like if you think of it in terms of like all of those things, I think are to do with how people engage with something.
Yeah,
they're like they're almost like trying to find things which will be not necessarily universally understood or relatable, but certainly to the people that are concerned with that project. So it's like about understanding, I guess what's shared culturally, what would be significant that people would understand that it's doing something different, but yet is rooted in a particular approach, which are all kind of like gambits in a way. Like how do you make connections with people? How do you transmit ideas, or and those kinds of things in spatial architectural terms might not be so literary. They might be to do with a spatial language or a kind of functional language, or material language which we're familiar with. But it might be, so in that case, it might be like borrowing a bit of a kind of cathedral plan crossed with a warehouse like materiality, let's say.
Right.
Somehow, look, it's not necessarily that people will see the ingredients of that, but it's that that through the fusing of those sorts of of diverse languages, that something which has resonance is produced. And I would say that's similar to the way that I write. Like, first of all, I think I'm often concerned with the kind of the opening gambit. Like, I'm very concerned. What's the first line? Like,
yeah.
How do you greet the time-starved?
Honestly, for a really long time, I could not sit down to write something until I knew what the first sentence was. And I would just turn over the first sentence in my head for weeks, while I'm on the bus, while I'm walking around. And then when I got the first sentence, then I could sit down and write it. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And, for me, often the first line in the end ends up being the last line.
Yeah.
But it's in terms of like a place that gets me going. Yeah. It's important to know that sort of sets the tone for a piece. But I suppose it's also I think when I'm writing, I do draw on kind of other languages. You could say like things which are often outside of architecture. I mean, I read a lot, so there's often like phrases sort of rolling around in my mind, even tones of voice or just ways of making an argument or ways of expressing something. So I'm kind of constantly, in sort of literary terms, like borrowing all of those kinds of things and tricks, which I feel like I'm doing also in a design sense. I'm often working very, not, with a knowledge of history and a knowledge of precedent, and kind of often like figuring, like part of the way to figure out a project is to figure out where it sits within, let's say, the map of the universe of design ever done. Yeah.
Do you think since you started writing and now that this has become kind of a big part of what you do, has it changed how you think about the design work, or has the actual architecture and the making part been influenced by writing and the process of writing and kind of thinking through that form?
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, I'd say like the way that I approach writing is I don't know how you described it in your opening gambit, but something about like a sort of haziness, right? So I would say that, for better or worse, that my writing, the way that the pieces that I've written, tend not to like aim for a conclusion.
Right.
They sort of aim for forming connections.
Right.
And so that the sort of that's what it produces. And sometimes it uses kind of imagery, which can be quite visual or quite visceral, I think anyway, to sort of illustrate maybe a point which is less intellectual and more like I hesitate to use the word emotional, but something that you feel first rather than think. And
interesting.
And I feel that's sort of what a lot of the design work is trying to do as well. It's trying to kind of work towards a sensation, and that the kinds of imagery which I think I sometimes use, or certainly the things that it makes me think of, often suggest kind of possibilities in certain parts of designing things. Like, how do you bring different kinds of things together? What kind of sensation do you want to create? Like, is it possible to make something which is like a little bit disgusting or a little bit icky, or is it possible to make something which is like super smooth and almost ethereal, like those kinds of sentiments? And I feel in some ways that releases the design work from having to like establish like a singular aesthetic, because it's dealing with this sort of like relationships between things. So I think that like that happens in the way that I write, and it definitely happens in the way that we design stuff Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of that kind of like emotion and thinking, and you mentioned earlier that you don't necessarily see your work or your writing as overly academic. Do you think about an audience when you're writing? Like, do you have a certain type of reader that you're expecting or that you're writing for, or how do you think about kind of about that emotion or about that tone? You were talking about like voice and tone earlier. How do you think about that?
I don't know. To begin with, it was like me. It was
Yeah, right. Of course.
I was the audience, or like a kind of idealized version of myself,
Right.
and that made me as a writer into an idealized version of myself,
Yeah,
also.
yeah, yeah. I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, which is important, I think. Um, uh,
Yeah.
I mean, yes and no. Like I have this weird sensation, like if I write for different people, like sometimes it completely throws me,
Right.
like for a different title, let's say, and suddenly I'm like, what do I do? Like,
Right.
how do I
Yeah.
write?
Yeah.
Who am I? What is my tone? And it's not that I definitely don't believe that, writing is any more authentic than an expression of like, a sense of self, than anything else. I totally believe that it's a completely unnatural, like synthetic activity, which is not expressing any interiority
Yeah. Yeah.
whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like a thing. The like me as a writer is me as a kind of constructed entity,
Right.
just as me as a designer is not me expressing myself. It's me kind of creating first of all constructing myself as a
Right. Yeah.
designer.
Yeah. That's interesting. You're exactly right.
It's an exact. I mean, I teach a a, a writing course
Oh.
at UIC in Chicago, and it sits alongside the work which the students do, which is more straightforwardly academic, and so we do much more kind of like the stuff which I'm familiar with, like writing short
Right.
review type things, and eventually it kind of spirals into other things. But one of the things I'm always like really rammed down their throats. They're probably sick of me saying it, which is like, when you're writing, it's not you. It's you can decide who you
That's
are
so
as a writer,
Yeah.
and you don't have to write the same every time. So often we've done exercises by writing in different kinds of language. So writing in the language of very technical forms of writing, like even the kinds of RFQs which
Mhm.
us architects spend an awful lot of time
Yeah.
reading, responding to,
Yeah.
or in the voice of other writers, and just as experiments in like, well, what does it feel like to write like somebody else, and to
Yeah.
break down that
Yeah.
myth of yourself as a kind of fully formed thing, that all you need to do is find the right voice for it to let it come out. I believe that like writing is so much more like design, is that you can't just put it down there. You have to like work it through and figure it out.
Yeah.
You don't know what it's going to be until it's done.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is why I'm terrible at pitching writing, because like if someone says, oh, if you like, if I wanted to pitch something to somebody, I would never be able to say, oh, I've got this idea for a piece, because I don't have an idea for a piece. I just have a feeling for something that would be good to write about.
Right.
I don't know what that is until I've written it.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of maybe a blessing and a curse.
I want to pause for a second and talk more about this writing class that you're teaching. I didn't know you were teaching a writing class. I taught a design writing class when was that? Last spring, and I'm doing it again next semester. And the last time that I taught it, it was with graduate students in a graphic design MFA program. It was the first time I'd ever taught it, and it was probably the hardest class I've ever taught. And so I don't know if I have a question other than I would love to hear you talk more about the class that you teach and kind of how you think about it and kind of what you do. And this might be completely selfish, just as I try to think about how I'm going to do it again. So these are architecture students, and is it writing about architecture, or is it just kind of general writing?
It's it's an elective which most of them are architects, but it's also part of the as a kind of module as part of the Masters of Art and Design Criticism, pithily known as Mad Crit.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so their backgrounds vary, but it's about architecture and design, but usually it's sort of in that hazy area between the two, and sometimes around the world. Sometimes about using design to talk about the world.
Yeah.
Basically, what I do.
Right.
And so it's run like my kind of fantasy idea of what a creative writing course is like, which is we write a lot of pieces and then we sit around and talk about them and often read them out loud to each other and go through them kind of word by word and line by line and paragraph by paragraph to think about how writing works.
Yeah.
And it usually now it's sort of got into a kind of a kind of pattern, which begins with a very direct task, which is to go to a supermarket or a dollar store and buy something. Like can be anything that they are attracted to, and then they have to review it.
Okay.
So it's like how do you review an apple? Or like, and of course,
I love that. Yeah.
A lip balm or or just any sort of average product. This year we had a cheese grater. Like it's just like really boring things, basically.
Yeah,
really
I love that.
Usually very, very ordinary, but sometimes a bit like that sort of like confusing fusion of things that happens at the very bottom end of like capitalism.
Yeah.
And so the sort of the first sort of critical task is to like, okay, what's a review? What does a review do if it's not saying something's good or bad? Like, how does a good review is not like a thumbs up and a thumbs down. It's more a way of like allowing the reader to sort of understand a way of looking at the world, or particularly the world through a thing. In my opinion, anyway. From that, like it this year we've kind of zoomed out. So it was first of all the object, then it was the space where that object most likely would be, and then it was the sort of system which supports that. So a thing, a space, and a kind of more invisible network.
Yeah.
The idea being that all of those things are part of the designed world, but they often are not, in the disciplinary sense, are often kind of placed in different areas. One is product design, industrial design, one's architecture, and one's like system design or something like that. And this year it's flipped. So they're now turning the attitudes they've made, that they've developed through the writing, into a design project at the end.
Oh, interesting.
A piece of furniture, a pizza that tells the history of the pizza. Like, in a sense, it's sort of exploring like, maybe like similar territory to what we were talking about earlier, which is what's the relationship between writing and designing, and how can that have, how can you use writing as a sort of productive way to think about like material, spatial things.
I love that. I mean, that was kind of, I don't mean to make this now just me talking about the design writing class that I taught, but like that, to me, that was the thing that was hard when I taught it, is I went in with this really kind of grandiose goal that I wanted to show my students that design and writing were actually very similar forms of expression, and that you can kind of use both of them to articulate your ideas. And I think I got too in the weeds on talking about that idea that we didn't really have time, that it ended up making both sides of them weaker, because we were just talking about the connections between them. And so I think that kind of process that you just talked about is actually like a really nice, clear way to kind of build up to that, instead of just keeping it in the kind of theory side.
Yeah. And alongside that, like, we've done a few readings of things which I think are great examples of writing about design, which, so, it'd be like Roland Barthes, Joan Didion, and what else did we read this time? A supposedly fun thing.
Oh,
which I'll never forget.
Yeah, David Foster Wallace.
Exactly. So things which are written by, in those last two, well, in all cases, they're not design critics.
Right.
But like, we read of Joan Didion, we read two pieces this year. One is Many Mansions, which is her review of, or her piece about the California governor's mansion that was commissioned by, but never lived in by Ronald Reagan.
Oh, I don't think I read this.
It's really great.
Okay.
And it's called, of course, it's a piece about politics, and fits in with her later writing about the Reagan administration. But it's really fantastic. And the other one of hers that we read was called Holy Water.
Oh, so yeah. I read this one.
So that one's about the kind of infrastructure of bringing fresh water to LA, and her trip to the kind of like the kind of control room, and her like kind of amazing fascination with the machinery and the moving of water over mountains. And I think those are examples of people who are writing about sort of accidentally writing about design. Like, I don't think design writing should be distinct from the rest of the world, just as like design should not be distinct from the rest of the world.
Yes.
And so to see people who are almost like incidentally being able to be incredibly acute about the descriptions of formal things, it is, I think, really, it's very inspiring to me. And it's also very instructive, because you see different ways of writing about it. It's not the same people that you would expect to be writing. It's not the same. It's a different kind of language. It's a different way of associating like things to politics, or to the construction, or to ecology, or to I think they're really. I think they're really good and perhaps foundational texts of a different way of like writing about the designed world, or the synthetic world of human habitat, which is what I think the subject is really.
Yeah, I love that. Do you think, I'm going to ask you this question in two ways. I asked you the inverse earlier. Do you think that being an architect, being trained as an architect, has that influenced, or does that have any influence on how you write and kind of your writing process, and then even how you read, that you could read Joan Didion as a quote unquote design critic, because you're kind of coming from that world? What does that kind of education and work have on your writing and reading experience?
I had I think what's similar between architecture and journalism, in a sense, is that both are very, very broad and very shallow.
Yeah.
So, I did my undergraduate at the Mackintosh School of Architecture in Glasgow, and in a sense, it was a very traditional kind of, sort of mid to late 20th century idea of architecture. But but what that meant was that we had obviously we had like studio, but we also had, talks on structures. We had to do little calculations. So, it was not my strong point, I have to say. But we also had, talks on the built environment, which was the history of the sort of politics of planning, which was really fantastic. And then we had a history of architecture from the beginning of architecture in their way of looking, which is the Lion's Gate, Mycenae, if you want to know where architecture started.
That's good to know.
Yeah, it's good to have a kind of origin point. But even between those things, and within the MAC is part of the Glasgow School of Art, so sort of in a kind of very creative context. Like between all of those things, I think it was for me, it was absolutely perfect, because on the one hand, it was kind of, kind of social history and politics of planning from New Lanark, a kind of, sort of Owenite factory town, through to the post-war reconstruction and new towns, and the beginning of the collapse of that kind of idea of the welfare state, alongside, quite hardcore modernist architectural education, alongside kind of the sort of social education I got from hanging around in the art school. And so that, for me, that was absolutely perfect, because it did have that kind of breadth, and it did have that feeling of like spinning plates, and that somehow, not sure how, why, these things are actually related. And perhaps it was only later that it became possible to see how the different parts of those sorts of those streams actually have a lot to do with each other. How the politics of of aesthetics or form or material are actually really significant, and vice versa. How design might help us imagine other sort of forms of small p or social construction.
I'm curious kind of what you're thinking about right now, or what are some subjects or topics that you've been on your mind, either in your design practice or things you're wanting to write about. Where's your interest right now?
So design practice, I think we've been working very hard over the last, I guess, like 4 years, and I think the studio sort of it's got a lot of projects under its belt in a short amount of time, which have, I think, really feel like they've developed a very, I'd say, very strong attitude towards material and space. And I think that's been really exciting to be part of, and to see these things emerge. Partly because it's for me, it's a slightly different, it's a different kind of approach. It's a different sensibility. It's a different way of making things, that's been really exciting. And I feel like there's more that we can do in I suppose, like how those kinds of things get manifested at larger scale, or in more complex situations. So that's kind of what we're working towards. Like how does the things we've done maybe in exhibition designs become more part of a kind of permanent world. So at the same time, sort of So I think that's. I think understanding a bit of what have done, I think part of what is important. And at the same time, I think we've managed to develop a kind of language of objects. We've produced quite a lot of objects, which is a relatively new thing for me, really, which is also fascinating. And those feel really like kind of miniature statements, miniature think pieces. Like they're always objects which in part are about being objects.
Right.
And so I feel like that's like something that we're definitely kind of doing more of. In terms of like, what are the issues? I mean, I feel like I mean, I feel like everybody else that in some senses, the real kind of pressing concerns now are not ones which strike you as being aesthetic or and so I am interested in how I'm interested in how the world is produced. I'm interested in engaging and being critical, kind of with/against those kind of mechanisms, at the same time as using a kind of design sensibility and imagining alternatives to that. In some ways that's different, but in some ways it's like I mean, I always thought that there was a kind of political content to what I was writing. I don't know if other people thought that.
Oh, interesting.
But so, for example, like, one of the new things I'm doing is kind of acting like as a developer on a project, which is forging a new relationship between like kind of me as a private entity and a very like small and local charity. And so we're developing a project which will hopefully kind of produce a kind of multiple forms of benefit, multiple forms of value to all of us. And that feels like something really different. But, again comes from the sensibility of putting different things together in order to produce an alternative outcome. So in that sense, it feels like exactly part of the same way of thinking. And I think shows that there are possibilities for how, things which may seem to be kind of like ideas which are outliers or even kind of concerns which are removed from the real world are actually completely engaged with the world as it is and utterly concerned with producing an alternative possibility. And so I mean that feels like it's something that has happened at sporadic moments in projects that I've been involved in, but it's something which feels really pressing now. So that's something I would hopefully be thinking about more.
Yeah. I love that. I'm completely with you on that. My last question, you mentioned a couple of the readings that you give to your design writing class, and you mentioned earlier that you read a lot. I'm curious, who are some of your favorite writers, or who are the writers that have kind of influenced how you think about writing or your own practice, or even books? You don't have to limit it to writers. What are the books or writers that have influenced you?
What am I reading at the moment? I'm reading.
Sure.
So I'm reading two books at the moment. One is called The Lonely Londoner. Lonely Londoners. And it's a book about West Indian immigrants in the 1950s. And I've only just started it, but it seems interesting, and it seems part of a line of books I've been reading about London at that time. So another one is it's got sort of cult classic Absolute Beginners, which had an 80s film. There was an 80s film semi-musical starring, who was in it? Yeah, David Bowie was in it, but
I've never heard of this.
In it, he definitely did the theme tune for it. I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway, but that's also set in the 50s. And then another one about a seedy, unlucky guy a book called The Low Life, set at the same time. And it's really interesting to read like a kind of, a series of books about a particular city at a particular moment in time when things are changing. And, there's three different perspectives. One is like a kind of, an immigrant culture and their experience. Another is teenagers, at the birth of the teenager. And the third is a guy who's involved in like sort of deals and gambling and property. And it's sort of, things like that are really I think, give you a different way of understanding how the city has been produced, but also experiences of the city. And the other one that I'm reading is a book which I read a book by Olivia Laing, the writer Olivia Laing, called The Lonely City.
Yeah.
Great book, which looks at Manhattan through, first of all, her own lonely experience of moving there, and but what she did to overcome her, or to deal with her feelings of loneliness, was to sort of we spend a lot of time looking at art. And so that book is organized in chapters which look at different experiences of loneliness in Manhattan, or often in Manhattan, through the eyes of different artists.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there's the sort of loneliness of Warhol. There's Hopper both as a kind of painter of loneliness,
right,
who has his own kind of issues with loneliness, so on and so forth. And in that book, she talks a lot about a book called Gentrification of the Mind, which is sort of come out, I don't know, like 2008, 9, 10, or something like that, which is about essentially, it seems to be about like gentrification in Manhattan, but especially its relationship to AIDS and HIV.
Oh, interesting.
So it's a really, like, that's also like a kind of another sort of, I guess, a line of books that I've been reading. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, like the way that I read, I think, does shift and change, like what I'm interested in terms of writing, and even how I write. Like, it's sometimes quite embarrassing, like how absorb the tone of a particular writer, and what am I doing writing like this? This person, impersonation of them. But I mean, I read pretty voraciously, so it's very, I find that really useful in just like unlocking different ways of thinking, unlocking different ways of looking at things.
I think that's a great way to end this. Sam, thank you so much. Like I said at the beginning, I'm a big fan of you and your work, and have been wanting to talk to you for a while. I thought this was such a great conversation, so thanks for being on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure. It was really fun.
This episode was recorded on November 9th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.